Good morrow, everyone, and welcome to episode 10 of Shakespeare and Friends, the series in which we engage with some of the big questions surrounding Shakespeare and early modern history. I'm Darren Freebury-Jones, and my co-host is Rachel Aanstad, and today we're exploring the question, how queer was Shakespeare? I think this episode title was born under a rhyming planet, Rachel. So I wondered if we could get the ball rolling. Maybe if you could define queerness and offer some historical context.
Well, queer is a word with a long history to it. And, you know, what was originally kind of a slur has been co opted by the community to, uh, it's sort of an all inclusive word. And the LGBTQT alphabet, it's a little unwieldy. Letters get added or subtracted depending on who you're talking to. And so queer is sort of a nice inclusive term of basically anybody who is not heterosexual and specifically people who are cisgendered heterosexuals. So that follows along, what has become culturally thought of as the default pattern, even though of course it's not default at all. Everybody is very different. Everybody has different orientations, perhaps inclinations that they may not even fully discover, for a long time. It can take a long time to figure out who you are and who you are attracted to and so on. So that's a big messy generalization of how we're using the term here today. It's also very important to note that the idea of a sexual orientation identity is a very recent one. We're talking 20th century. Before then, people did not identify themselves based on who they were attracted to. It was a completely separate thing. You were identified much more by your religion, by your status, by where you had been born, or by where you were living now. All of those things were of much greater import than who you happen to love. And the idea of loving and of sexuality and all of that was kind of understood that people had all different kinds of tastes, of inclinations, of orientations, as we would say now. And, the proof of that is how, at certain points in history, they tried to outlaw some of those expressions. So, you don't provide laws around something that's not happening. And, we see this going way back. But we're going to start with the ancient Greeks because, in part, because they're so well documented that, uh, you know, we don't have a whole lot of ideas about queer identities and, people activities before then. But we know that the ancient Greeks found same-sex lovers as being perfectly fine, even as being kind of more admirable than heterosexual ones, in particular for men. And for a long time, there was this tradition of an older man and a much younger man. And unfortunately, that often, delved into areas that we can't even talk about on here without risking a strike on our account. So we're not going to go in that direction. But for many, many years, it was as a romantic relationship, as lovers, it was thought that two men loving each other was better than a man loving a woman who was, technically inferior in that sense. Now, the important part of this was that the man, the grown man, was supposed to be dominant, was supposed to be the penetrative partner. And the one who was penetrated was considered, submissive or less than the penetrative partner. And so for that reason, it was fine. And this continued right through Rome. It was fine for one man to penetrate another man, particularly if the man being penetrated was an enslaved person or somebody of obviously lower rank. If it was two full citizens, then that was frowned upon, because the issue was not so much that a man was having sex with a man as that the act of penetration was seen as a military act, as a way of possessing and dominating another person. Well, that's all fine if you're dominating a woman, any woman. But if you're dominating another man and he's a full citizen, then that can bring shame upon him. And this was an issue that followed Caesar for all of his days, because there was a rumor, who knows how substantiated, we can't tell, it was, centuries ago, that he had been the submissive partner to another man when he was working as his, assistant, servant, whatever. And this rumor that he had been the penetrated partner caused problems for him. It would be brought up, how can we follow this man, who is not fully a man? So that was a kind of a serious issue, and, added kind of a forbiddenness to penetrative sex that we think of today as censuring homosexual behavior, which it wasn't. It wasn't at all. It's a whole different way of thinking about it. By the same token, women making love to each other was fine, provided that neither of them had a object with which to penetrate the other person. I'm being careful because we're on YouTube and I don't want to get any strikes, but in general, whatever women did with each other was fine, so long as there wasn't a simulated penis involved. And this continued right through the medieval era. People do tend to be less threatened or squeamish, for whatever reason, about the idea of two women kissing and so on. That doesn't mean that there weren't women who were, put to death for having a sexual relationship with another woman. But it was pretty rare, with a few differences. We're talking about thousands of years of history here. It was pretty rare for either men or women to be put to death or, otherwise horribly persecuted for their sexual activities. This really changed like around the 12th century or so. And, obviously by then, Christianity, Judeo-Christian values were, everywhere throughout Europe. And Christianity had a very different attitude towards sexuality than the pagan Greeks and Romans did. They just kind of accepted it as part of life. So that really brings us up. Let me see if I missed anything. Let's see. Oh, Justinian uh, in the 6th century uh, really was uncomfortable with same-sex acts and considered it heresy. At some point, the Christians decided that people making love was very much God's business. And once that happened, uh, people got a little strange about it all, in my opinion. Um, let's see here. Thomas Aquinas ranks sodomy as second only to murder in gravity, defining it as a violation of the natural order of procreation. And, again, there weren't less queer people then than there are now. And, abbeys in particular, we can imagine, right? We've got a lot of same sex communities. There were people having same sex love affairs. And in a sense, that environment could be a kind of a haven for people, who were queer. Um, Although, you had to be careful. But there were abbeys lots of abbeys that they were very lax, let's put it that way, in terms of their permission. And there were lots of Catholic priests who had women, on the side. People will get up to business. So let's see here. Okay, now then we've got Henry VIII converted the former ecclesiastical, it's always a fun word to say, ecclesiastical sin of sodomy into a secular capital felony for the first time. And so that moved it out of the religious courts and into the secular courts. And I'm sure, that was a mixed blessing as well. Sometimes that could be good, sometimes it could be bad. Then when, during the Renaissance, when all of these, ancient Greek and Roman texts and all this art, started to really filter into Europe from Islam and from Byzantium, then this idea of kind of the glamour of same-sex love became very much part of the aesthetic. And as a result of this, there was a lot of sort of, oh, I'm pretending to be gay. Oh, me too. I'm pretending to be gay. And, sometimes people can pretend to be gay right into a love affair. And I think, at least it was fashionable then. And then, if you were caught, you could say, oh, well, we were just pretending. It's all part of the culture at that point to glorify, the Greco-Roman aesthetic. And so with that came a kind of funny acceptance of same-sex relationships. One of the really interesting things I find about queerness in Shakespeare's time is that the real concern was in terms of sexual continence, in that you needed to be able to control your sexual urges. And it was understood that when you were young, that was more difficult. And so there was kind of a lot of leeway for, people in their early 20s, kind of much like now, we expect people to to experiment, to, unless we're part of a very restrictive religious community, people are expected to have more than one partner, to basically try things out before they settle down with somebody and try to raise a family and all of that. And it was kind of thought that any man who continued to do that after he was in his 30s was embarrassing. And so, well, we can talk about Twelfth Night later, but I think that there's a lot in Twelfth Night that kind of plays with that issue in terms of Malvolio and Toby and certain of the other characters. But it was at the time kind of expected that a well-to-do mature man would have a wife, of course, and who knows how many mistresses or whatever, how many ever they could afford and wanted, and that they would have a younger male companion who could also possibly be a sexual partner. As long as the man had children, provided for his family, upheld the family name, and so on, nobody really much cared what he did in the privacy of his or somebody else's bedroom. If you could keep up with all your responsibilities, then that was fine. Again, it was considered embarrassing if you were out chasing a lot of younger women or younger men or who knows. It was just like, oh my gosh, why can't he keep it in his trousers?
In his breeches.
In his breeches, exactly. Why can't he keep it in his codpiece? So it's at this point where Shakespeare comes in. So take it away, Darren.
Enter Shakespeare, yes. But I think it's worth considering some of Shakespeare's dramatic and poetic predecessors and contemporaries who could be considered, queer artists or queer poets or dramatists. I mean, Christopher Marlowe really leaps out in the first instance. Marlowe reputed to have said, "All who love not tobacco and boys are fools," which I think is such a kick-ass statement. I hope he did say that. It's very memorable. But you think of some of Marlowe's plays, and having seen them in performance myself, Edward II, for example, that feels a lot more explicitly homoerotic than many Shakespeare plays I've encountered in performance, where you've got Edward II and his homoerotic desire for the nobleman Piers Gaveston. And you've also got Dido, Queen of Carthage, which opens with a curtain parted, and you have Jupiter dandling Ganymede, the most beautiful of mortals in Greek and Roman mythology, on his knee. And then you've got poets such as Richard Barnfield, who wrote poems such as The Affectionate Shepherd, which seem a lot more explicitly homoerotic than several of Shakespeare's works. And it's worth thinking as well, we talked a lot about sexuality, but in terms of gender, and cross-dressing heroines, very popular in Renaissance Italian literature. And of course, dramatists in early modern London, they were ransacking Italian sources for inspiration. So the likes of Cinthio or Giovanni Fiorentino or Matteo Bandello, and sometimes those Italian sources and influences were mediated by translations. So Shakespeare's primary source for Twelfth Night, for example, is Barnaby Rich's 1581 work, Apollonius and Scylla. And you can see some of Shakespeare's dramatic forebears reaching for those Italian influences. So John Lilly really stands out in terms of being quite transgressive, I think, in some of his plays. Galatea, which is a fantastic drama, and it's set in Lincolnshire. And so that Neptune doesn't flood Lincolnshire, every 5 years, a fair virgin must be sacrificed. And, you know, a couple of the fair virgins not very pleased about this arrangement. So you have Galatea and Phillida. They go off to an enchanting and enchanted woods in male disguise, and they meet up and don't realize that they're both disguised females and fall in love. And at the end of that play, John Lilly has Venus transform one of these heroines into a boy so they can marry, but he never actually tells us who. And you also have my friend Robert Greene calling Shakespeare an upstart crow. He has a play, James IV, the Scottish history of James IV, where curiously his main source is Geraldi Cinthio. And in James IV, James is quite an unhistorical figure in Greene's dramatization, but it's an absolute git. And he falls in love with another woman and so orders the assassination of his wife, Dorothea. So Dorothea escapes the court in disguise as a page boy, and she finds herself in a house owned by a chap given the name Sir Cuthbert Anderson. And Mrs. Anderson, as I'll call her, takes a liking to this page boy. So there's a kind of lesbianic undertones there. It's not too dissimilar to Phoebe and Rosalind in As You Like It. So there were lots of poets and dramatists exploring different elements of queerness. And we see that in Shakespeare, of course. We see cross-dressing right from The Two Gentlemen of Verona, where you have a heroine named Julia. She pursues her lover Proteus, who is a mutable figure, Protean, as his name suggests, and a bit like Greene's James IV, an absolute git. And she disguises herself as a male under the name Sebastian, which is very interesting. Of course, you have Sebastian in Twelfth Night. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about his relationship with Antonio. And Saint Sebastian, sometimes seen as something of a gay icon. Lots of queer iconography surrounding Saint Sebastian. And I believe it was a pseudonym that Oscar Wilde used as well. And then you have cross-dressing in lots of other Shakespeare plays as well, of course. You have cross-dressing as a means to navigate society. We see Portia disguising herself as a lawyer. We see Shylock's daughter, Jessica, in a lovely boy's apparel in order to escape the patriarchal confines of Shylock. And perhaps most famously, we have Rosalind, who adopts the name of Jove's own page, Ganymede. And what you often find in Shakespeare's comedies is that they end with a sense of normative gender roles and sexuality. And what the actor playing Rosalind does at the conclusion of As You Like It is very much stresses, I am a boy actor, but also quite daringly offers to kiss as many of the audience members as had beards that pleased me. And it's something I've been connecting recently to the pantomime dame. This is a figure historically played by a man who will often pick a stooge, one male audience member, and have a little bit of fun with some flirtatious banter with that audience member. But we mentioned Twelfth Night. I think Twelfth Night is the play that really stands out to me in terms of sexuality. Almost got a tripartite structure in terms of homoerotic relationships and gender fluidity. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on some of the queer relationships in Twelfth Night, Rachel.
Well, it is one of my favorite plays, and I think this is partly why, is because there's so much room for different expressions of love and of sexuality in a really non-judgmental way. You know, Sebastian and Antonio land on the beach, and it's clear from the dialogue that they've had a few months at sea together, and that Antonio is deeply in love with Sebastian. And when I was first really getting serious about Shakespeare and wanting to direct the play, and I thought, well, maybe this relationship between Antonio and Sebastian has been kind of blown out of proportion by our current kind of fascination with queerness. And so, I did a real close reading of it to make sure that if I played up that part of the relationship between them on stage, that I wasn't making mountains out of molehills. And what I found was not molehills and not mountains, but whole mountain ranges, essentially, of, the more I looked into the language between them and the way people expressed strong feelings at the time, the more it was clear that Antonio had picked Sebastian up, plucked him out of the sea. Sebastian had introduced himself as Rodrigo, so poor Antonio didn't even know his name. And then, once they hit dry land, Sebastian's kind of like, all right, thanks, bye, thinking perhaps that this is just, an interlude in his life. That, he's in a situation, he's found by a handsome pirate, and, of course, he preferred to stay in the captain's chamber and so on, and probably even genuinely was fond of Antonio, but he clearly wasn't looking at it as a permanent thing the way Antonio was. And one of the things that I love about Twelfth Night is that Antonio is, of all the characters, the one that embodies true love. He's selfless, he's generous, he tries to protect Sebastian, gives him all his money. I mean, it goes on and on. And
risks his life, doesn't he? He has many enemies in Duke Orsino's court. Yeah,
he risks his freedom and loses it. And when you see all the nobles, and as usual, they're lying, they're pretending to be people that they aren't. Sebastian marries Olivia, after knowing her for 5 minutes,
quite literally, yes.
And you get the feeling that his commitment to Olivia is probably no stronger than his commitment was to Antonio. Under those circumstances, how can they possibly be? And then we've got Viola Cesario, who is in love with God, I've forgotten his name. What's his name?
Orsino. I was just going to say, but before we move on to Viola / Cesario, it's interesting, isn't it? What's in a name? Juliet asks in Romeo and Juliet. And I think for Shakespeare, there was rather a lot in a name. And it's interesting with some of the naming conventions and the implications, I think, for Shakespeare, that you have Sebastian again, and Antonio. Think of other Antonios
over and over and over again. And
Merchant of Venice stands out to me, where because I agree. I think Antonio in Twelfth Night, his relationship with Sebastian, it looks less like the Ciceronian definition of ideal male friendship and more like unrequited homosexual, as we might say today, desire or love. But I think of Antonio in The Merchant of Venice, and I think the text indicates that he's an older male, and he's still very much single, and I think that he has got a desire for Bassanio in that play. So just interesting when you're thinking of Shakespeare's names and what those names might have sparked in his mind, and to go back to Viola, who isn't named in Act 5. Yeah, Orsino gets on with Viola / Cesario very quickly. Within 3 days, we're told by Valentine he has unclasped the book even of his secret soul. So sorry to interject, I just got excited.
No, that's what we do here, Darren.
Tell me more about your thoughts on Viola and Orsino.
I don't know if you can hear my dog complaining in the background, but I have summoned my assistant who arrived shortly to relieve my dog of his condition of being stuck in here with me. So, but yeah, when we look at the relationship between Orsino and Cesario, again, we're playing with homoerotic themes here because Orsino is obviously attracted to Cesario very strongly. The text makes that very clear. Festi makes that very clear. And, the whole changeable taffeta line.
Yes.
It feels very queer coded to me.
Yeah. It's one of my favorite phrases in the play, that is changeable as taffeta. Yeah.
Wonderful. So, and then, Viola herself, her confusion about how, she's presenting as male. Well, she's presenting as a eunuch, which is a whole other issue that we should touch upon. But assigned male at birth, let's put it that way. She's presenting as that. And, both Orsino and Olivia are tremendously attracted to her in that presentation. And, it's important for us to keep in mind that a eunuch was thought of as its own gender. In other words, once you became a eunuch, you were this third thing. And eunuchs were forbidden as marriage partners. And so, occasionally I'll come across an analysis of Twelfth Night that says, Shakespeare seems to have forgotten that Viola was presenting herself as a eunuch. And I don't think it's forgotten at all. There's a number of puns that indicate that that's very much in the forefront of certainly the characters' minds. And it explains a lot about why it was so transgressive for Olivia to be attracted to Cesario. Because technically, in their eyes, Cesario was not a man, and therefore, she couldn't marry them. And it also explains kind of why at the end, when the big reveal and everybody figures out who's attracted to who, and Orsino says, I really need to see an address. I think it wasn't just that Orsino needed to know that Cesario was Viola and female, but also that he wasn't marrying a eunuch. Because that would have been a problem at the time. That would have been essentially heresy. He could have been, kicked out of the church and everything else. So it's just, the whole thing is fascinating to me. How, how permeable these sexual identities were, how fluid and fun. This is fun. This is a fun play. Uh,
Mm,
Nobody's getting burned at the stake. Nobody,
mm,
poor Antonio gets taken away. Although, we don't know what happens to him at the end. Uh, but it is a comedy. People are getting married. And the people who lose at the end, Malvolio is really the only loser, are the ones who were not playing with gender identity.
mm,
It was the older man who did not have his passions under control.
mm.
Uh,
It's deliciously meta-theatrical, Twelfth Night as well, I
mm,
think. And of course, there's something that I guess is a little bit lost in performance today, often, unless you have an all-male troupe like the Lord Chamberlain's Men, when you have these boy actors playing female roles who then disguise themselves as males, and it's very onion-like, isn't it? Plenty of
really is.
layers. And but some productions today will have a little bit of fun with the conclusion, where it's interesting that Violet is still in male attire at the end,
Mhm.
and when Orsino says, "While you are a man," some productions will just offer the merest hint that Orsino's potentially more interested in the male disguise than the noble woman beneath that disguise. But lots of ways to play around with that. But I do find it quite fascinating that Viola is still contending with disguise as a wickedness
Mhm.
at the end of that play, and visually probably looks like the closest thing to a gay marriage in Shakespeare, where it does look like you have two males, or potentially a male and a eunuch.
Yeah.
We'll check after the curtains close, maybe. But I mentioned that it's tripartite in terms of relationships, and you
Mhm.
also have uh, homoerotic relationship between Viola and Olivia,
Mhm.
and there's a lovely speech that Cesario gives about Olivia. She says, "Lady, you are the cruellest she alive, if you will lead these graces to the grave and leave the world no copy." And I found that so interesting, because essentially she's saying, in order to perpetuate or preserve your beauty, you need to procreate. And it very much ties into the first 17 of Shakespeare's 154 sonnets published in
Mhm.
1609, the procreation sonnet. So interesting to see Shakespeare exploring similar topics, similar ideas, similar relationships, albeit across different genders in his poetry and his dramatic works. Yeah.
Definitely. And I, I think also we ought to look at Midsummer Night's Dream,
Ah.
because the relationship between Helena and Hermia is, you know, very homoerotic. You know,
Mm,
we were as, two cherries on one stem sitting on one cushion.
mm,
There's a lot of language in there that, when you go through a body dictionary and word by word do a close reading, it could easily be taken to assume that they had a very intimate relationship as young
mm,
women, and that this betrayal that that Helena and both Hermia feel about it is more than because they were friends, but also possibly because they were lovers. And
mm,
Helena's whole character is very vague gender wise, and there's a lot of kind of double entendre in there, because we know that this is a girl being played by a boy, and that comes through much more with Helena than it does with Hermia, for some reason. Perhaps because Helena is, in a sense, feels more wronged than Hermia does. Helena feels very betrayed by Hermia. First, for attracting Lysander's attention, and then for what she views as being part of this kind of bullying campaign by all three of her friends, who are all for some reason being extra mean to her now. And so I think a lot of that language comes through. Hermia is kind of more busy moping about Lysander, which I understand, no shade, but I find Helena to be a really interesting character that way. But I have never gotten into the sonnets. The plays are all I can handle. So, but I do think it's important that we talk about the sonnets.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of my first experiences of Shakespeare was memorizing Sonnet 18 on my own volition. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? But I am a bit like you, I think, Rachel, a bit more into the dramas than the sonnets. And they've been called bisexual in tone, the sonnets. And you have very interesting dynamics expressed across those 154 poems where you have, I guess, a sense of the pederastic tradition where you have this older male advising the younger male to procreate in order to extend his beauty, and then you have this exploration of the power of poetry to immortalize that younger male, and then you have the dark lady and the rival poet, and so many scholars and just general members of the public have spent a long time trying to work out who is the dark lady, who is the rival poet, who is the fair youth. And going way back to the likes of Edmund Malone, a lot of scholars have and still do see the sonnets as very autobiographical. I'm personally not so sure about that. I don't think they're as explicitly autobiographical as some people tend to think. And who knows? I might be very wrong. Potentially, I'm right. Maybe some of these figures in the sonnets are composites of people that Shakespeare did meet in real life, but they feel very dramatic to me. Yes. As a sonnet sequence. And we know, or we believe, I should say, published in 1609, they were distributed, Shakespeare's sugared sonnets among his private friends, as Francis Mears tells us. But we believe that a lot of the sonnets were written in the mid-1590s up to the early 17th century. And you have this poetic figure who plays around, puns on the name Will, but he often describes himself as being old or aging, and there's a contrast between that aging process and the fair youth. Think of Sonnet 73, for example. Sonnet 73, we believe, was written in the mid-1590s, so Shakespeare wasn't terribly old. So for me, I think he's exploring a lot of topics, a lot of themes, and of course there are going to be elements of Shakespeare within the sonnets, but I have heard people say, well, the sonnets prove that in today's parlance Shakespeare was gay. And the fact of the matter is, we don't have any documentary evidence to support that. We know Shakespeare was married. We know that he had 3 children. There's a contemporaneous account by the law student John Manningham that no doubt you will be familiar with, Rachel, but I really enjoy this one. And just in case anyone watching or listening isn't familiar, the anecdote, which I will embellish, goes that Richard Burbage, Shakespeare's star actor, was playing Richard III, And after a performance, he encountered what we might call a groupie today. So a woman who was very fond of him in the role of Richard III, shall we say. And she said to Richard Burbage, "Come to my chamber this evening by the name of Richard III." And according to John Manningham's account, Shakespeare overheard this conversation and arrived at the lady's bedroom chamber, knocked the door, and said, "Richard III is here." The inevitable happened. And then afterwards, Richard Burbage knocked on the door and said, "Richard III is here." To which Shakespeare called out, "William the Conqueror came before Richard III." And what I love about Manningham's account is he completely ruins the joke by really emphasizing at the end that Shakespeare's name being William. It's like, let's ruin this joke by explaining it.
Let's step all over it by explaining it.
Yeah.
I think too that the idea of bisexuality just really escapes a lot of people, and I find this a little peculiar because we are, as human beings, very sexual beings. And, honestly, in a darkened room, all things being equal, one mouth feels very much like another mouth. It's not, the body doesn't care. The body is often responding to friction, to a certain amount of lubrication. People use all kinds of devices to handle their physical needs, which completely natural. And so I think this fascination between the separation of making love to one gender versus another, again, a very 20th and 21st century. And it comes in part from this trend we have in this culture to identify based on, who somebody has their sexual experiences with. And, I don't understand how it works. Let me be the first to say it's a frigging mystery. I don't know. I don't know why some people are only attracted to the same gender. Some people are attracted to, their opposite. I hesitate to say opposite because it's a continuum. That's why I'm kind of stumbling over my words here. But heterosexual relationships and so on. But bisexuality was, in a sense, considered the norm for thousands and thousands of years. The thought was that anybody could be sexually attracted to anything. It could be a tree. It could, heaven forfend, be an animal. It could be, who knows what, a supernatural being. I mean, we've got Leda and the Swan. Way back in ancient Greece, Zeus, for some reason, turns himself into a swan to seduce Leda. And she was okay enough with that to have children with the swan. So this idea of putting people in these very kind of rigid boxes is a pretty recent thing. And it was understood that even if a man was married, that didn't necessarily mean that that's where his sexual inclinations lay. Going back to the ancient Greeks again, it was assumed that a man could have female lovers, male lovers. It really didn't matter. And so, when people try to sort of slice and dice historical figures of Shakespeare included and say, oh, well, he's obviously gay. Oh, no, he's a human being and clearly understood enough about all kinds of romantic entanglements and sexual relationships to write about them convincingly. Now, that doesn't mean that he had to experience all those himself, but to my mind, knowing theater people, it would be odd if he had at some point had all those experiences himself that were freely available to any man of his age and station at the time. That doesn't mean they defined him.
Mm.
And if he did not participate in those himself, he clearly observed them. He understood them. That doesn't mean I think he was watching, necessarily, but he clearly understood that kind of tenderness between people, regardless of gender. And, that shows again through all of his plays that he is able to show tenderness and attraction between two people, regardless of what their genders really are, and regardless of who is performing them, and so on. So uh, I think we're getting close to answering the
Yes.
question.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the Folger, I believe is the Folger, he described Shakespeare as a queer artist. So how queer was Shakespeare? Well, in terms of the sonnets, in terms of the plays, there's myriad more examples we could give. Iago and Othello, for example.
Mhm.
I am your own forever. That really stands out as a moment where the line between homosociality and what we call homosexuality is blurred. But
and,
there were a lot of. Oh, go on. Sorry.
and certainly explains Iago's behavior in a way that nothing else does. I mean, what else are his motivations?
Oh,
For
he's got an all-you-can-eat buffet of potential motives. I think Iago, hasn't he? That's why he's so endlessly fascinating. Yeah.
I don't know. I see eliminating his rival. I mean, I can see. I mean, he's a complicated character. I'm certainly not going to
Yes.
try to minimize that. But for me, the idea that he's eliminating a love rival
Mm,
feels more genuine than
mm,
you know why why target her specifically
mm.
otherwise. So anyway, yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, but there were a lot of poets and dramatists who could be considered queer artists. So from the likes of your Richard Barnfields to your John Lillys to your Christopher Marlowes. So it was an exciting time, of course, is the Renaissance period in terms of creativity and uh, exploring history and mythology and sampling different cultures.
So how queer was Shakespeare?
I think he was pretty queer.
I think
Yeah, yeah.
I think so too.
I'm not sure if he was as queer as Christopher Marlowe in terms of his output, but yeah, pretty queer. And there's just a wonderful elasticity to Shakespeare, I
Mhm.
think.
And
Yeah,
I think too. I think we can look at the whole early modern period
yeah.
and say it was pretty darn queer.
Mm,
And Shakespeare very much is a man of his time. I think is exactly as queer as the times that he lived in. And
mm,
so, again, there's this because we're so hung up on this stuff, in our own time. Uh, it's like, oh, he was queer. And then, this idea that because it was a previous time, that people were more uptight about gender and sexuality. it is simply not borne out by
Mm.
the research. People had, very interesting and complicated ideas of gender and sexuality in the 16th century. And, he reflected that perfectly. And, we can even kind of say, well, we know that his plays were reasonably popular. Uh, obviously no Ben Jonson, but, you know, popular enough to put butts in the seats in, late 16th century uh, England. And there isn't a lot of sturm and dang, let's say, about the sexuality and gender representation in his plays. And it doesn't seem to have caused any kind of stir, didn't get into any kind of trouble, uh, ever. And so we can kind of say, well, you know, he was expressing mores that were more or less, let's say, familiar, if not completely accepted by everyone, because the Puritans didn't like it.
No.
Definitely not so controversial that it got him in the Star Chamber, for example.
Mm. I think it's something audiences would have enjoyed. And that's why so many dramatists are reaching for cross-dressing heroines or those kind of relationships between people of the same gender. And I think dramatists like Shakespeare, they're poking a little bit of fun at the Puritans.
Absolutely.
The likes of Philip Stubbs, who says that these male actors playing female roles will turn everyone into sodomites and catamites. And it's interesting when we think of Twelfth Night, with that comic antagonist figure of Malvolio, that he is referred to as a kind of Puritan by Maria, isn't he?
Yep, definitely.
And
Definitely.
as you said, he and Andrew Aguchik, they stand outside of that comic resolution, don't they? And they haven't been involved in those kind of gender fluid, carnivalesque relationships we've witnessed throughout that lovely play.
And, this is not to neglect all the other instances in Shakespeare's plays where there's queer coded behavior that sometimes is looked on as negative, uh, sometimes almost does become kind of a referendum against gay coded behavior. But the stories, the plots, also make that a context for those situations. It's not a universal condemnation for queer coded behavior. And today, because we've got our own strange brand of Puritanism happening now in our culture, it's always humorous to see people who are advocating for some sort of return to a mythical kind of heteronormative patriarchy and calling up Shakespeare as some sort of bastion of heteronormativity is always it's always entertaining. But I can't even be induced now to argue with them anymore. But it's pretty funny. So yeah, very heckin' queer, Shakespeare. Good job.
Yeah, good stuff. Yeah, it's such a fascinating topic. And I always forget, Rachel, is it now Writer's Corner or book recommendations? I always forget. I think it's Writer's Corner.
We do Writer's Corner because
You remind me every single episode. I always forget.
Because I'm under this probably an illusion that people are waiting with bated breath to get our book recommendations. So I always put those at the end as kind of a teaser. But of course, if you don't want to listen to all this, you can just look at the write-up under the video and you can see our book recommendations right there. You don't have to sit here and listen to us.
Don't tell them that, Rachel. Don't tell them that.
But yeah, so, here we are, Writer's Corner.
Yeah. So what are you up to at the moment? Have you been
Well,
writing since we last spoke?
uh, I always am. And, I've been kind of veering a little ways from Shakespeare lately, but, of course, it always comes back to Shakespeare eventually. But, uh,
Hmm.
I'm kind of really interested right now in this idea of the meander and the grid and market spaces and how our ideas of living space and working space became separated from each other. This is a very Calvinist, Protestant kind of tradition. And one of the insights that I had as I was working on this is that when we talk about the separation of live work space, we are automatically ignoring the fact that that women's work is work, and you cannot have a separation of living space and working space as long as you recognize that cooking and cleaning and caring for children is a lot of work, is a lot of labor, and just as important, if not more so, than any other kind of work. And it's a very recent idea that you should have your serious work in one place and your domestic work in another. That's a very recent invention and is proving to not work very well. Um,
Hmm.
in Shakespeare's time, there was no such thing. Your household was a kind of corporation. Uh, we know that Shakespeare and Anne that they sold malt. They sold. Uh, we have a record of that they had. Uh, like many people did, their home in the country was also kind of a farm and, produced agricultural goods and everything else. And, this idea that that a husband and wife were very much a business partnership goes back thousands of years. And it's a very artificial separation to think that men make the money and women feed the babies. That's not ever how it was. Even, for a long time, guilds were, theoretically only the men could join a guild. But that did not mean that women did not participate, say, in making gloves or farming or any of these other things. They were equal partners. They were recognized as skilled artisans. They just couldn't be part of, the boys' club that made all the rules. Now, if a man died, then his wife or his daughter sometimes actually could join the guild, or she would have her son-in-law or her brother or whatever take care of the guild business for her, and she would continue to run the business. And this even occurred, in banking families. I was writing about the Fuggers not too long ago. Fuggers were this amazing uh, German banking family that pretty much ran the world
What are they
through
called? The Fuggers.
mhm, the
Hmm.
Fugger family, Fugger. Those damn Fuggers, and
Oh, my childish sense of humor is yeah, okay.
well, it's earned. It's earned. I mean, I won't go into the Fuggers in detail here because it's
I can't deal with you
it's not
talking
our
about them.
room.
It's just every time I hear the name, I just want to laugh.
But they were the financiers for the Holy Roman Emperor and for the Spanish royal family, for many royal families. They were the bankers and financiers and uh, basically funded the the Spanish exploration of the Americas and everything else. And as a result, they got a lot of silver. They had first claim to all that silver that came over, and eventually the the Spanish monarchy became bankrupted because they kept borrowing money and saying, yeah, I'll give you the silver when it gets here. And then they would give them all the silver and there was nothing left. So anyway, Jacob Fugger, go ahead, giggle. His mother basically ran the Fugger empire after his father had died for years and years and years. So
Oh gosh.
and
Fugger Empire. Sorry.
and
So
they
childish.
became one of the really the impetus for the Reformation because they went around collecting money, indulgences. They were the reason that people were paying these huge indulgences, and indulgence was a way of buying your ticket into heaven or buying a loved one's ticket into heaven. And, they would go around the country and say, hey, you give us your money. Any sin you do will be forgiven. Any sin can be forgiven. And so, of course, a lot of people, were willing to pay for that rather than to be in hell. But this was one of the biggest reasons why the Reformation started, because, there were a few people who went, oh, okay, come on, wait a minute. The reason you're collecting this money is to repay the Fuggers for your debt. And so there is no doubt that there were plenty of people who called him a Fugger and meant exactly what you are hearing, those damn Fuggers. So anyway.
Well, it sounds like an unforgettable
Anyway, I'm
period
not
in
sure how we
history.
got on this tangent.
I've loved it. I've loved it.
I talk about that a lot in my silver book, which is still at my copy editor of the first draft. She's going through there. You know, there's this feeling after writing a book. It's like, okay, great. It made sense to me. I wonder if it'll ever make sense to anybody else. Have I, really written something, or is this just a fever dream that I
I know exactly what you mean. That I will finish a 90,000 word book, and I can imagine handing it to somebody and saying, would you mind offering your feedback, and it being a little bit like that scene in The Shining where she looks at Jack Nicholson's manuscript and it's just all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. And I just think, is this just utter drivel? Is this just rigmarole? Because I think there is a process, isn't there, that you really get bitten by the bug. It's a flame of passion, and then you come out of it and you think, what is this? What is this?
What have I made?
Yes, yeah.
What I made? And then there's the curse of knowledge too, right? We're so deep in it that we don't always know. We never know what our audience knows. And we never know, have we over-explained something? Have we made assumptions? Of course, everybody knows who Jacob Fugger is. No, nobody knows who Jacob Fugger is.
I am an ignoramus, and I'm sure lots of people watching will think, how did he not know about the Fuggers, and why is he giggling like a child?
I assure you, you are not alone at giggling or at not knowing who they were. I didn't know who they were, until I started.
I feel better now.
Really looking into it. And I had that same feeling of like, oh, look, all these history books I'm reading, they all assume I know who this was. And, even 50 years ago, more of us would have known. It's just kind of, we have so much going on now in terms of different ways, the way we think of money and the way we, economics and all that is gotten very complicated in the present day. And so there's, I think, less reliance or less interest in looking back at the past at a time when these kinds of realities would have been, these kinds of people would have been better known. But yeah, so my book on silver is off my long-suffering editors, um, and I'm excited to get it back. And then in the meantime, this other book has kind of gripped me. Um, it's a very different book uh, in that my background is environmental design and architecture. I worked as an architectural designer for 20 years or whatever. And so uh, there's a lot more kind of lived experience of, observations about things. It required a lot less, kind of the in-depth, painstaking research that, for instance, Shakespeare's, the characters in Shakespeare's histories plays. Um, it's a very different kind of writing, and I'm enjoying it. Although it feels like I'm cheating
Yeah,
a
yeah.
little bit, you know. Um, but and it's also going to be very heavily illustrated because I'm talking about these different building types, about the souks, the ancient markets, versus the champagne fairs, all of that. And so, in a book like this, a lot of your credibility actually comes from the illustrations because I can show a section of like a typical medieval house with a shop on the bottom and living quarters above and everything. And I don't need to cite anybody for that. Anybody can look at that and go, oh yeah, that's the way it was. And so that's kind of fun. I got myself some new mechanical pencils, and I'm looking forward to doing some illustrating.
So do you have a publisher in mind with that? Do you think you'll finish
I
off the
do.
first draft? You do? Okay, cool.
I do have a publisher in mind, but there's a few. If they don't like it, uh, I'm I'm nervous about it, as we always are submitting to publishers unless we know for sure that they're gonna love something. Um,
Oh, we would never know that. Yeah,
no,
yeah.
you would never know. But and I did actually start work on a proposal. Uh, I like having a contract before I start. I found it's very motivating. However, I thought that I would need a contract in terms of motivation wise to keep me focused on a project. Uh,
Mm,
I hadn't needed that in the past when I just wrote and published myself. But once you get a contract before you write a book, it's a pretty heady feeling, to
yeah.
wake up in the morning and think, somebody cares if I finish this. Uh,
Mm,
it's very nice. It's very motivating. And I was afraid that if I didn't have that, that I might find it more difficult to stay motivated. But I'm happy to report that that's not the case.
that's
And
good.
just the fact that, I've gotten 3 publishing contracts already makes
Amazing.
me
Yeah.
feel a lot more self-confident about finding one for this book. And so it's a strange book in that I talk about the history, but I'm also looking at solutions for the future. We had recently a housing bill passed here in the United States that's, thank goodness, finally, we've had a housing crisis here for a few decades. But a housing bill passed that's going to make it easier to convert these, you know, hundreds of abandoned office towers and shopping malls into domestic spaces. And so I'm interested in how we can uh, do that in such a way that goes beyond the live workspace of a house on the of a shop on the bottom and a house on the top, which doesn't work for us anymore because if we're a shoemaker, that doesn't mean all our kids want to be shoemakers, right? We don't have that same kind of focused familial uh, corporation kind of a thing. So yeah, so that's what I'm up to. And how is how is the pant? I saw you got a very nice review from one of
Yeah. Well,
your beta readers.
I sent the draft off to a few pantomime experts, and
Nice.
yeah, so far, because I felt exactly like you were saying. What are people going to think of this? Had the lovely Philip Rowe, our mutual friend in Dickensian terms, got back to me today and said I was skeptical at first, but he loves the way I explore the connections and the way I don't profess that the connections between Shakespeare and Panto are linear in any
Right.
way.
Right.
But when we last spoke, yeah, I'd finished drafting it, and I was exhausted. I said, I said, oh, I'm gonna take a break from writing. But I've been, just the way things have gone, I've been on this lovely summer break, an extended break, which has given me opportunity to get on with some projects quite far in advance. So very recently, I finished drafting it's for a collection, a chapter on, it's called English Seneca, is my working title. Shakespeare and antecedent revenge tragedies. So
Oh, nice.
it starts off with Thomas Nash's accounts of writers who will bleed Seneca line by line and page by page. And it looks at the ways in which different dramatists took Senecan influences and effectively Englished it for the commercial stage. So thinking about Thomas Kids and those Senecan elements such as a ghost bellowing for revenge, but also how those influences were mediated by other writers who we might not instantly think of when we conjure that term revenge tragedy, such as Robert Greene, for example. And it also encompasses Christopher Marlowe, George Peele, that most prolific of writers, Anonymous. And there's been a lot written on Seneca and the revenge tragedy genre, but my approach has been looking at it in terms of audience memory and how I think Shakespeare stimulated audience memory of prior or contemporaneous revenge tragedies in order to essentially regenerate what must have felt like quite a stale genre at the turn of the century when
Mhm.
he wrote Hamlet. And contemporaneously, you have John Marston reviving the revenge tragedy genre in his Antonio's Revenge. I mean, that's not due in for a long time, but I thought, well, I'll draft that. So I finished that one. Another project I'm involved in that I've also drafted a chapter for, another book collection, is about Shakespeare and AI. And I mean, this is a topic that we could spend hours talking about, so we won't. But it's so fascinating because what I do in that chapter is look at the anxieties conjured by AI and some of the discussions that we're experiencing today, particularly in the media, particularly from authors. And whilst not treating them as historical equivalents, I compare those anxieties and discussions to the Elizabethan grammar school education or acting during the period, where you have the likes of Robert Greene complaining about these mimics, these mere apes on stage. Also, the print industry, the notion of audiences or actors cobbling plays together from memory. So that, pun intended, generated quite a lot of thoughts and was such a fun chapter to write. So those have been my two most recent projects. So, but I always find that curious, and it's something I often experience. I get that sense of being utterly exhausted by a big writing project and think, oh, I need to take a big break. And then I just get this burst of renewed energy. So it's been really lovely to have the time to to devote to quite disparate topics, albeit, as you reminded me in a previous episode, well, they're all kind of Shakespearean, aren't they? They're not as disparate as the incredible leaps you do in terms of topics.
Well, I've had more time. Let's put it that way. I've had a few more decades to, kind of rack up these interests, and I think they do all sort of come back when it really comes down to it. Is this particular century, even these particular decades in history, are so pivotal.
Yeah.
For how we look at the world, for what happens in terms of all of a sudden there's all this influence from the Americas into Europe. There's massive shift of what happens in terms of Europe's relationship with Asia and with Africa, and for better and worse, in all kinds of ways. It's just a very intense, pivotal time, and we can just mine it endlessly for insights into what our world is like today, how our world is today. And so, yeah, we keep going back to that. Well, definitely. Even my silver book really pivots on that time period from when there was the Great Bullion Famine, which is, one of my pet topics, but and how the Age of Exploration was a natural extension of that. People saying, oh my gosh, we don't have any silver or gold. I guess we better go find some. And they did. Well, I'm just excited. Do you have anything kind of in the back of your mind for your next kind of big project that you want to do?
No, not yet. I've got some pretty big project, the collected plays of Robert Greene. So waiting for editors to submit materials for that. But yeah, it's been a case of being commissioned for chapters in book collections at the moment, really. So
well, that's awesome.
Yeah, rather than just plucking ideas just out of thin air.
Well,
got
you
that
and I
template. Yeah,
have toyed with the idea of writing a book together, but we have not come up with any kind of a topic yet. We haven't.
I think Shakespeare and Friends would make for a great book, and we have, of course, co-authored, and I'm sure we can speak more about this in a future
now we
episode.
can talk about this. Yeah.
But we've co-authored an exciting another book chapter on Shakespeare podcasts, and that was lovely. I learned a great deal from you with all of your experience and knowledge of podcasts, and it was nice to reach out to podcasters, many of whom we've both guested on, and get their never before heard insights on Shakespeare podcasts. So that was very interesting.
You did all the heavy lifting on that article.
No, not at all, not at all.
Absolutely did. And I went into it somewhat kicking and screaming. I actually had a lot of fun when it came to actually part of it. So.
I thought it was a really interesting snapshot in terms of academia and where we are in the world, and podcast as a communal enterprise, and the ability for scholars and creatives to reach such a broad constituency anywhere with internet access, essentially. And it was really interesting as well. We won't give away too many spoilers, but speaking to so many different podcasters and some of the synergies in terms of challenges they've all encountered. Yeah, so like I said, really interesting snapshot of academia and the world as it stands, I think, but through the qualitative lens of Shakespeare podcast. I really enjoyed writing it with you. Yeah.
And that's going to be an Arden book, right?
Yeah, it's going to be in an Arden collection, so we will wait to hear back from our editor, and fingers crossed, all goes smoothly. But yeah, it was fun. It was fun. So we'll see. We'll see what's next on the horizon. But I thought I've got a bit of time now. I'll just smash through some
Yeah.
first drafts for various projects,
All
and
right. Well, I'm excited to see what you do next. I think the Panto and Shakespeare book is was a stroke of genius to come up with. I think that's excellent.
oh, that's very kind. But I've loved it. I've loved it. I'm looking forward to opportunities to speak about it in a
Mhm.
sustained way, on podcasts and so on. And I've talked about it pretty much every episode of our series, but to devote an hour
Oh
to
no,
it,
no, to talk about it, and also it's so fun to get questions
yes,
about it
yeah,
because then you have insights, and it's especially nice to do that, I suppose, before the book is finished.
yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah.
not something that I've done. I guess I need to start doing the podcast rounds myself. So
But I've been thinking so far in advance that I've drafted the whole index, not in terms of the page numbers, of
right,
course, but
right,
I've
right.
drafted, all of the terms in the index, which of course will be malleable. The book might change significantly for all I know. I hope
Hmm.
not. It's pretty good. But yeah, that was something I did in recent days. Was I thought, oh, blast through the index now. So yeah, maybe I'll take a break for a week or so.
Oh, why would you? Why would you? I mean, we write because we enjoy writing, not
Yeah,
because you know we're forced to do so uh,
yeah,
out of expectation. We enjoy it. That doesn't mean that it's not hard, or that
mm,
there are times when we don't enjoy it, because there are times that it's not necessarily so much fun. But
yeah,
you know, like any other kind of exercise, it seems to be something we need, and so
yes, yeah,
we'll
yeah,
just keep doing it, I guess. Huh? All right,
yeah,
shall we do book recommendations? What you got?
yeah. So I mean, this was hard. This is such a huge topic,
Mm.
and there are reams of amazing books and essays I could recommend. So, including by several colleagues. So, but this is my list that I thought spoke to what I spoke about in this episode. So, first off, if you haven't read it, you really must. Will Tosh's Straight Acting: The Many Queer Lives of William Shakespeare. And that's such a wonderful historical analysis, and it's a really engaging and accessible 2024 book. And if you're interested in learning a little bit more about Richard Barnfield, I would check out the wonderful Fabio, Ciambella, Cristiano, Ragni, and Camilla Caporicci's Richard Barnfield's Poetics, Early Modern English Poetry Beyond Shakespeare. And that came out 2025. In terms of sonnets, it's a truly beautiful collection. All the sonnets of Shakespeare, edited by Stanley Wells and Paul Edmondson. And what they do, very interestingly, with the sonnets is they actually include all the sonnets of Shakespeare. So they include sonnets that are integrated into plays such as Henry V, Love's Labour's Lost, Romeo and Juliet. But they also order the sonnets in terms of chronology. So when we think Shakespeare wrote them, and in doing that, they're drawing from the work of MacDonald P. Jackson, dating Shakespeare's sonnets, Some Old Evidence Revisited. That was published in Notes and Queries in 2002. And if you're interested in early modern anxieties surrounding cross dressing, I would recommend Stephen Orgel's Impersonations, The Performance of Gender in Shakespeare's England. That was published in 1996. If you're interested in learning more about John Lilly, you simply have to check out Andy Kesson's John Lilly and Early Modern Authorship, published with Manchester University Press in 2011. And I've added a couple of my own books because I write quite a lot on Robert Greene in terms of cross-dressing with Dorothea. So my book, Reading Robert Greene, Recovering Shakespeare's Rival, published with Routledge in 2022. And I also delve pretty deep into not only Robert Greene, but also John Lilly, and looking at cross-dressing in Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers, How Early Modern Playwrights Shaped the World's Greatest Writer, which was also published with Manchester University Press in 2024.
Awesome. Well, I had Orgel's book on my list as well. It's a wonderful book.
My apologies.
No. That makes it magisterial, right? Officially.
Oh, go magisterial again. Yeah. Yes.
I think it's a beautifully written book and very easy to enjoy. And I did not include a lot of books about sexuality in ancient Greece and Rome. There's a lot of books out there. They're easy to find. But a lot of the books that I recommend have more to do with our time period. Let's see, I've got Alan Bray, Homosexuality in Renaissance England. It was published by the Gay Men's Press in 1982. Men in Women's Clothing by Laura Levine. And she does some wonderful work talking about how the whole cross-dressing thing intersected with thoughts about gender and sexuality at the time. And, she makes a really interesting point that basically people felt like if you wore clothes from another gender, that you genuinely took on those attributes and those traits, that gender was very performative, almost more than it was biological. So we kind of talked about some of that stuff earlier, so I won't redo that here. Then there's Bruce Smith, Homosexual Desire in Shakespeare's England, A Cultural Poetics, and that has a lot of nice articles in there. Stanley Wells, Shakespeare, Sex and Love. I think you mentioned another one of his books. And finally, Jacqueline Van Hoot, Age in Love. Maybe it's Van Hout. I apologize, Jacqueline. Age in Love. And she goes into a lot of what I was talking about earlier about sexual continence and kind of the inherent bisexuality that was sort of assumed that most people felt. Whether they acted on that or not was another issue. And that was from 2019. And I loved her book. It really opened up my eyes on a lot of things, and especially Twelfth Night. And speaking of Twelfth Night, I have a book about Midsummer Night's Dream that I self-published, and a book about Twelfth Night, and I've talked about them both before, and both of them include sections about gender and sexuality in general in Shakespeare's time and in relation to those plays in particular.
Marvelous. I can't believe this is our 10th episode, Rachel.
Yay!
It feels like yesterday when we sat down and talked about ghosts.
I know. And that is still our most popular episode. I don't know if because a lot of people.
It's all. There was a real falling off. It's all downhill after Ghosts.
I don't know if it's because we got all our friends to listen to the first episode, and then they were like, "Yeah, okay, that was fine." Or
it was very topical. It was Halloween. It's a fascinating topic. Yeah,
I noticed also that people, they love the spooky and the ghoulish and all of that. So
Yeah.
and which is not my inclination. I'm all about
Uh,
fairies and
yeah,
and love and all of that. But
I'm all about the death and
I
murder.
know
So
that's
yeah,
kind of what makes us such a good partnership. Is that,
yeah.
we provide that sort of
You are the smiling mask, and I'm that tragic
yeah,
mask.
you're the trash.
It's the light and darkness. But we
Exactly.
won't give any spoilers away. But I think we've got some really exciting episodes coming up. So
What were we gonna do next? No,
no, no, don't. Let's
don't
not announce it
spoil it.
in case. Well, we might change our mind.
Oh,
So
we're not gonna change our mind.
you would often get that at the end of James Bond movies. They would say
Yeah,
James Bond will return in For Your Eyes Only.
yeah,
The end of The Spy Loved Me, and then they thought, oh no, Star Wars came out recently. Let's do Moonraker next. So I
right.
don't want to follow the erroneous pattern of James
All
Bond films
all
where
right. Well,
uh,
we got.
they change their mind.
Let's see. We've got August, September, and then we've got October again. And so
Yes, yeah,
that
and I'm
is
very excited for our Halloween episodes,
that is
and you less so, but
no, I'm excited. I'm excited about it. I'm looking forward to it. Um, yeah, it'll be good.
well, we reached the end of this episode. Thanks and ever thanks to those of you watching and listening to Shakespeare and Friends. Until the next time, it's a warm farewell from Rachel and me.